All right, welcome to this explainer. Today we're embarking on a pretty rigorous academic deconstruction of a highly popularized modern concept, and we're going to contrast contemporary prayer metrics directly against authentic, ancient biblical manuscripts. You see, for a lot of young adults today, modern spirituality has actually started to look incredibly similar to modern hustle culture, right? We're frequently told that we need to fight, to shout, aggressively declare things, and effectively work ourselves to the point of sheer exhaustion just to get God's attention. But here's where it gets fascinating. According to the exhaustive academic study titled Prayer Warriors, Biblical Teaching, there's a profound disconnect between these loud, aggressive spiritual practices and the quiet relational theology that is actually found in the ancient texts. So in this analysis, we're going to objectively examine historical derivations, lexical data, and syntactical evidence. Our goal? To evaluate whether this widely accepted prayer warrior identity is an actual scriptural mandate or, well, simply a modern cultural invention.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is exactly how we're breaking this down today. First, we'll look at the modern cultural construct. Second, its absence in ancient manuscripts. Third, misinterpreting the warfare metaphor. Fourth, the myth of prayer metrics. And finally, defining effective biblical prayer.
Section 1. The modern cultural construct.
Now, before we can truly understand what biblical prayer actually is, we really have to critically analyze the origins of the modern frameworks that have largely replaced it. We need to look closely at how a late 20th century phenomenon reshaped the way an entire generation approaches the very concept of communicating with the divine. So let's define our terms. A prayer warrior, in our contemporary vernacular, is an individual who engages in intensive, aggressively postured intercessory prayer. They often operate under this premise that their verbal declarations directly combat demonic forces or somehow exert leverage for divine intervention. But we have to ask, where did this actually come from? Well, according to the study Prayer Warriors, Biblical Teaching, this nomenclature is absolutely not ancient. Meta-analyses of modern religious movements actually trace the widespread institutionalization of this specific term to the late 20th century, largely stemming from the spiritual warfare and third-wave charismatic movements. For a modern audience, an audience totally accustomed to the hustle culture of doing more to get more, this translates perfectly into a sort of spiritualized hustle. Academically speaking, this represents what we call an eisegetic projection. If you aren't familiar with that term, think of an eisegetical projection like trying to force a modern iOS software update onto an ancient, fragile parchment scroll. It just doesn't fit. It's the act of bringing our modern militarized baggage and inserting it into an ancient text where it literally never existed. It essentially introduces a specialized elite class of intercessors that is entirely absent from historic Orthodox tradition.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the definitive conclusion drawn by the research. Honestly, it's paradigm shifting. The study states explicitly, and I quote, "The contemporary construct of a prayer warrior is a post-biblical cultural innovation that structurally contradicts Christological mandates." Think about what that means. Prayer is fundamentally designed as a communication device for making a request to a sovereign deity. It's not a literal combat operation. The prayer itself does not attack a situation, it doesn't attack a person, and, crucially, it fundamentally does not attack God. God is not an adversary to be conquered, nor is he some mechanical system that can be forced by human aggression. When an individual prays, they aren't wielding direct offensive force. They're acting as a messenger or an advocate making a plea. Therefore, on its own, the act of prayer is never an independent human attack on anything. It is strictly a request.
Section 2. Absence in ancient manuscripts. Let's transition now into a rigorous textual audit of the primary sources. Because, to validate any theological concept, we have to examine the original manuscript traditions. We need to see if our modern vernacular actually aligns with the ancient vocabulary. When we weigh the ancient vocabulary against our modern vernacular, conducting what scholars call a lexical syntactical analysis, which is really just a technical way of saying we're examining the words and how they're structured together, a stark contrast emerges. According to the data in Prayer Warriors, Biblical Teaching, the original Hebrew term for prayer is tefillah, and the Koine Greek terms are proseuche and desis. These ancient linguistic markers categorize prayer fundamentally as an act of relational petition, adoration, or communal pleading. They frame intercession entirely through the lens of relational mediation. What is completely absent in the historical, scriptural texts is any militarized tactical designation. These ancient terms for prayer lack any syntactical coupling with martial nouns, such as the Greek word stratiates, which means soldier. To put it simply, the original authors never paired the word for prayer with the word for warrior. The textual evidence demonstrates that biblical paradigms position believers as petitioners, relying on a sovereign God, not as tactical combatants issuing demands.
So the crucial point is captured in a major finding directly from the primary source material. The study notes, quote, "The specific modern vernacular compound noun prayer warrior does not exist in the Masoretic text or the Neso Elandum Novum Testamentum Grece." These are the foundational Hebrew and Greek texts of the Bible. According to the rigorous textual audit provided in the study, absolutely zero verifiable data exists to support a distinct biblical class of militant intercessors. This should be a pretty shocking realization for the modern believer. The foundational texts of the religion entirely lack the aggressive warrior branding that is so heavily popularized on modern social media and in contemporary congregations. The title is purely a modern metaphor that has been incorrectly literalized.
Section 3. Misinterpreting the warfare metaphor. So, if the terminology isn't in the original text, why is the concept so prevalent today? Well, this brings us to the frequent misinterpretation of passages like Ephesians 6, and it demands a necessary critique of the man-made idea that human beings independently attack spiritual forces. Ephesians 6 is frequently proof-texted to validate offensive, aggressive prayer tactics. However, an exhaustive analysis of this famous armor of God passage reveals a completely different picture. The Greek context for utilizing the armor revolves around the word histemi, which translates to stand firm. The posture is overwhelmingly strictly defensive. It's about spiritual endurance and vigilance, not charging onto a battlefield. Just think about how exhausting it is to constantly feel like you personally have to fight spiritual battles yourself versus what the biblical reality actually is. The sole offensive instrument mentioned is the sword of the Spirit, which the text explicitly identifies as the Word of God, meaning it is God's divine offensive action, not human firepower. Finally, prayer is mentioned merely as a communication device. Scriptural frameworks maintain that if an attack or decisive action occurs, God is the one who executes it. Human agency in this metaphor is positioned exclusively as a relational dependency. We may request that God act, but it is God doing the acting, not the person praying. We are not independent combatants.
And this brilliantly illustrates the point. According to the study, Prayer Warriors, Biblical Teaching, Jude 1:9 explicitly opposes the methodology of humans directly rebuking or attacking spiritual entities. Even Michael the archangel didn't presume to pronounce a blasphemous judgment, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." Think about that. Even Michael, an archangel, didn't presume to throw hands with spiritual forces. He deferred entirely to sovereign divine action. This proves conclusively that the biblical methodology permanently positions human agency strictly as a petitioner making requests. It fundamentally rejects the aggressive, combative posturing often adopted by modern intercessors who attempt to wield authority that they simply do not possess.
Section 4. The myth of prayer metrics.
We really must shift our lecture now to dismantle the modern metrics that are so often applied to prayer. This is that pervasive, deeply ingrained idea that volume, duration, repetition, or even the size of a crowd can somehow manipulate or mathematically coerce a divine outcome. The study points us directly to the lexical exegesis of Matthew 6:7. Here, Jesus issues a severe warning against a practice described by the Greek term batalogeo, which means to babble or repeat empty phrases. He specifically condemns the many words of those who think they will be heard simply because of their fluency or the sheer length of their speech. For a young adult today, this is essentially the spiritual equivalent of spamming or trying to hack the algorithm to force a result. Jesus explicitly condemned these mechanical, man-made ideas of trying to force God's hand through rapacious, long-winded prayers, exposing them as futile attempts to wield performative volume as leverage.
According to the analysis in Prayer Warriors' Biblical Teaching, the practices of modern intensive intercessory subcultures frequently diverge from biblical instructions. These rejected performative metrics include things like performative verbosity, repetitive formulations, extended vigils, and crowd size manipulation. While modern practitioners might view prolonged vocalizations as perseverance, textual analysts note that these methods mirror the exact behavioral patterns that Jesus prohibited. They look a lot more like pagan rituals than biblical faith. God is not a celestial vending machine where inserting more words, enduring longer hours, or gathering more people guarantees the transaction of an answered prayer. The scriptural reality is that human numerical volume or auditory duration absolutely cannot coerce an immutable divine decree. Let's move to and see how this builds regarding the specific issue of crowd size, because this is a big one. You'll often hear Matthew 18 quoted, where 2 or 3 are gathered, as a sort of formula to guarantee God acts on a general prayer. However, a detailed historical grammatical analysis validates that this is an eisegetical fallacy, which, again, means reading a meaning into the text that simply isn't there. According to Prayer Warriors' Biblical Teaching, lexical syntactical analysis confirms that Matthew 18 actually governs judicial assembly and church discipline, not general petitionary prayer.
The invocation of 2 or 3 explicitly mirrors the judicial mandate found in Deuteronomy 19:15 regarding the requirement for multiple court witnesses to establish a fact. It authenticates a community's disciplinary judgment. It does not serve as a quantitative multiplier to magically trigger a divine response for general requests.
The research goes even further in dismantling the crowd size myth. The study states, quote, "Extracting verse 20 to suggest divine presence is contingent upon group assembly contradicts the established scriptural theology of continuous indwelling. This is an argument of pneumatological consistency, which is just a scholarly way of describing the logical theology of how the Holy Spirit interacts with humanity." The study cites 1 Corinthians 6:17 and Hebrews 13:5 to show that the divine presence resides permanently within the individual believer. Therefore, human headcounts and treating crowd size as a mathematical multiplier are entirely man-made metrics intended to force God's hand. Now, yes, corporate prayer is an incredibly important expression of communal alignment and fellowship, but it is not a numerical mechanism of coercion that bypasses God's sovereign will.
Section 5. Defining effective biblical prayer. So now that we have deconstructed all these post-biblical cultural innovations, we have to enter the reconstruction phase of this explainer. What actually constitutes effective, answered prayer according to the scholarly texts? Scriptural texts consistently define effective prayer not by communicative volume, but by 3 distinct pillars. According to Prayer Warrior's biblical teaching, these are positional righteousness, subordination to divine will, and Christological brevity. We are fundamentally moving from the loud, chaotic, man-made metrics of modern culture over to the quiet, profound, ancient metrics of genuine biblical prayer. Effective prayer is fundamentally about who the petitioner is in their character and how they align their desires with the sovereign intent of the Creator, rather than what verbal formulas they employ. The first pillar is positional righteousness. The Greek term dikaios translates to a righteous person. According to James 5:16, it is the prayer of this righteous person that has great power. The efficacy of a prayer is permanently tethered to the petitioner's moral integrity and the relational standing with God. Honestly, this truth should profoundly relieve the burden on the believer. It is not about how loud you yell, it's about your moral alignment. The text indicates, such as in Proverbs 15:29 and Psalm 66:18, that unrepentant moral obstruction or unrighteous behavior actually hinders petitions. This permanently negates the requirement for tactical intercessory endurance. It values authenticity and integrity over performative loudness, emphasizing relational trust over the exhausting effort of shouting at the heavens. So the crucial point is really captured in the second pillar, the thelema, the Greek word for God's will. According to 1 John 5:14-15, confidence in petition relies directly on asking according to His will. This is the absolute condition for an answered petition. The study frames this brilliantly. Prayer is a cooperative submission of human desire to predetermined sovereign outcomes. It's not a mechanistic or combat-oriented tool to coerce or bend God to our will. Tactical formulas, length, and auditory volume are entirely irrelevant to a divine response if the request contradicts the dilemma. Effective biblical prayer is always marked by submission, never by coercion. And the final pillar is brevity, and this number perfectly encapsulates that, 70. I want you to imagine a modern 2-hour intensive prayer warrior rally filled with shouting, pacing, and just endless repetition. Now contrast that exhausting image with the profound, quiet brevity modeled by Jesus. According to the study, the original Greek text of the Lord's Prayer, the ultimate Christological paradigm of effective petition, contains under 70 words. That's it. It models direct communication and strict structural subordination to divine authority with the phrase, "Your will be done." This fundamentally dismantles the academic premise that vocal volume, combative posturing, or long durations hold any influence whatsoever over divine agency. To summarize this exhaustive academic analysis, we have journeyed from debunking the modern cultural myths of the spiritual hustle through a rigorous audit of the original Greek and Hebrew texts to landing on a scripturally sound definition of what prayer actually is. We turn to the concluding statement of the study, Prayer Warriors, Biblical Teaching. It states firmly, quote, "Strict exegesis demonstrates that biblical efficacy in prayer relies strictly on the moral alignment and positional righteousness of the petitioner, rather than volume, duration, or militarized verbal tactics. Prayer at its absolute core is relational communication. It is a humble request made by a righteous individual aligning themselves with the will of a sovereign God. It is not, and never was, a weaponized, independent human attack." All of this leaves us with a highly critical choice in how we approach our own spiritual disciplines today. Will you trade the exhausting performative hustle of a prayer warrior for the quiet, unshakable confidence of a righteous petitioner? True biblical efficacy doesn't require you to yell, chant, or pretend to command the spiritual realm. It requires moral integrity and a humble submission to God's will. Tomorrow morning, when you approach the divine, maybe take a step back from the modern cultural inventions, drop the exhausting metrics, and anchor your practice in the ancient, authentic manuscripts.